Hi, Dennis. I think you have to unmute.
Yes, hello. Hi,
There we
hello,
go.
Rob. Just me and you.
Okay, just getting everything set up this side. Hi, John.
Are you, Rabbi? Hello.
Just making sure I'm set up here. Can you all hear me clearly?
Can hear you, yeah. Can you hear us?
Oh, I can't hear you. Let me see what's going on. Now, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
And I can hear you now. Okay, perfect. We've got it set up. Okay, great. Okay, Chag Sameach everyone. Ma'adim V'Simcha. It is a Monday, although you're seeing me, and usually I'm here on a Wednesday. Rabbi Goldman unfortunately had a funeral today, so he's asked me to swap days. I was available, so I'm here on Monday, and decided today to broadcast from the sukkah. You can see the leaves above me. So we combining the two mitzvahs of sitting in the sukkah and studying together. And it's exciting because today we start a new section of the Halakha in the Rambam. If you did manage to print out your copies before Yom Tov, hopefully you went through the final chapters of the laws of Sefer Torah that we had begun learning last week. And today we begin with the laws of Tzitzit. So I'm going to share the screen so those who rely on the text on the screen will have it available. Hold on a moment. I'm using a different computer. I'm just hoping that it will. Wait, it looks like the YouTube might not be working.
That's it.
Let me just see if I can make this a bit bigger. Okay, there we go. Move this out the way. Sorry. Okay, here we go. I hope everyone can see that. And we begin the first chapter. It's 3 chapters that we will learn of the laws of Tzitzit, beginning today with the first chapter. And as we have in each of the new segments of Rambam, he'll reiterate the particular mitzvah that these laws are illuminating, that these laws are articulating. So the mitzvah of Tzitzit, as the Rambam writes on the top of the page here, is one mitzvah taseh. It's a single positive mitzvah, and that is the mitzvah to make tzitzit, and we'll define exactly what it is that we call tzitzit. On the corner of our garments, we'll also define what exactly a garment is for the purpose of tzitzit. So, but in essence, it's one mitzvah that we're learning, one mitzvah that we're describing and defining. In practice, we often refer to tzitzit as what is more correctly termed the talit katan, the small talit. That's the talit garment that we wear on our bodies. And then we refer to the talit gadol as the talit, but it's really the same mitzvah. A 4-cornered garment, as we'll learn, that has tassels attached to it. What we'll see is that the way the Rambam defines how those tassels are attached, or the particular way in which they are wound and bound, so on, is a little bit different to the way most of us are familiar with. The common practice follows more the later codifiers, but we'll see the Rambam's view. And in that way, we're also able to differentiate between what is actually the biblical requirement and what is the rabbinic addition, so to speak, that defines the particulars of the way in which we have our tzitzis or our talit. Okay, so the first halakha. So the tassel that we attach to the fringe, to the corner of a garment, that is of the same fabric of the garment, is called tzitzit. it's important to note that Rambam will mention a little bit later that for the purpose of tzitzit, the only materials that are actually obligated in tzitzit would be wool or linen. And we'll see references to both wool and linen. The natural color of wool and linen are both white, and we'll see that's important in a moment. And also this point that the fabric of the tassel is the same as that of the garment is in accordance with that understanding of where the requirement for the tzitzit is. So he says, but it's those tassels, these tassels that hang off the corner, the fringe of the garment, that's what we call tzitzit. Where does this name tzitzit come from? He said, similar to the idea of tzitzit of the head, which is a lock of hair, as we have in the verse in Ezekiel, and he took me by the locks of my head. And he says, we refer to these strands as the white strands because there is no command to color them or to dye them. In a moment, we'll see that part of them should ideally be dyed. Now, the Rambam says right up front that the amount of tassels is not specified in the Torah. So the amounts that we speak about is something that is brought down later. It's part of the oral tradition. The second halacha. And we take an additional strand, okay, besides for whatever you're going to have, and we'll specify what it ought to be, and that strand should be colored like the sky. And this is referred to, as you know, as the tchelet, as we say in the verses, vayat patil tchelet. And again, so you attach these also, you bind them to the tassel, and there's no specific number given in the Torah. So he elaborates now. So we find that this is one mitzvah that's made up of two kind of commands. That you should have these tassels coming off the corner of the garment. And on that tassel, there should also be one of the strands, at least one, as we'll see according to the Rambam, it's one specifically, should be blue. And this is why the verse concludes and says, V'asu lahem tzitzit, and you shall make for them tzitzit. And then it goes and says, and on the tzitzit you should place this strand of techelet. Now he clarifies, although it's two specific commands that you should have tassels, and these tassels, as he said in the first halakha, are going to be white. In addition to that, you should also add a tassel that is blue. So although it's two specific instructions, nonetheless, each one is okay without the other. That's what he goes into saying. The one does not prevent you from fulfilling the mitzvah without the other. So for example, if you had only a blue thread, or if you had only white threads without the blue threads, or if you had it originally white and blue and then the one came off, it's still considered a kosher tzitzit. Halacha, even though the one doesn't prevent you from fulfilling the mitzvah without the other. He emphasizes, however, that it remains only one mitzvah. And how do we see this? Because the sages have interpreted the verse, and they shall be for you as tzitzit. They being both the white tassels and the blue tassel. Now, now, but each corner does prevent you from fulfilling the mitzvah. That means you have to have a four-corner garment, as we'll learn, and each corner has to have tassels on it. If one corner is missing the tassels, then you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. In fact, if you had a garment that required tzitzit and it did not have tzitzit on it, you should not be wearing that garment because you would actually be transgressing that opportunity of being doing the mitzvah. He goes, so he concludes. He says, and if you're wearing a talit, if you're wearing a garment that has four corners, and each corner has either white or blue, or has both white and blue, you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit. Okay, so now how exactly do we fashion these tassels onto the garment? And here we get some of the particulars in the sixth halakha. How do you make it? Maschum is obvious shel talis. She sofa arug or marchig min lo yoser al shalosh etzbois l'mayla v'lo pachas mikesher. So I'm going to use this. So I hope you can see. You got the corner of a garment. He says basically from the edges of the garment you should go in up to 3 fingers length, but not less than 1 length from the top of the nail to the knuckle of your thumb. Okay, so that's the minimum amount you go away from the corner, a maximum up to 3 fingers. Okay, and it should be equal from this side and this side. And then in the middle of that corner, you make a hole, which you're going to thread the strings through. What do you thread through? So we know that hanging on the edge of the tzitzit over here are 8 strands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But these are 8 that are actually 4 longer strands which have been folded in half, right? I don't know how clearly you can see it, but it's been folded in half into that hole. You see that it's like looped onto it. So it's actually 4 long strands that have been threaded through the hole and folded in half. And then you get 8 hanging, okay? So that's what he says here. You take 4 through, so you bend them over in the middle, and now you find that you have this folded over 8 strings hanging. He says each of the length of these strings should be at least 4 finger breadths long, and if they are longer, even as long as 2 cubits, 2 amot, that's acceptable. And he just clarifies over here that for the purpose of these halachot, when we say our fingers breadth, we're talking about the thumb breadth. And he then says 1 out of the 8 should be blue, and the other 7 should be white. Now, this is not according to all opinions. The other, which means like this. That means 1 of the 4, half of it should be dyed, right? Because you've got 4 long strings that you're folding in half. According to the Rambam, 1 out of the 4, half of it should be dyed, so that when you have the 8 strings hanging like this, only 1 of them is blue. Okay, according to the later codifiers, some say that the entirety of 4, 1 of the 4 should be blue. That means you've got 2 hanging that are blue. Others are of the opinion that 2 out of the 4 should be entirely blue, and then you've got 4 out of them, 8 that are blue, right? According to the Rambam, only 1 out of the 8 that are hanging, which means half of 1 of the long 4, should be blue. Then what do we do? So according to the Rambam, and you'll as you try to imagine this, because I can't demonstrate fully over here, you'll realize that it's very different to the way in which we do it. I don't know how clear it is coming on the camera, but the way we do it, we've got 1 knot, then we've got a bunch of windings around the 4 strings together, the 8, another knot, another bunch of windings, another knot, another bunch of windings, another knot, for a total of 5 knots and 4 sections of windings. It's most common. This is the most common. And you'll have 7 windings here, 8 here, 11 here, and 13 here. Okay? The Rambam has it quite different. The Rambam says that once you've got these 4 strings, you take 1 of the white strings and you make 1 winding with the white string. And then you do 2 windings with the blue string. And he calls those 3 windings together, as we'll see over here. So he says, you take the 1 white and then the 2, and he calls hasholish chichos heim nikroim chulya. He calls this together a chulya, a segment. Then you leave a little bit of space, and then what you do is you do a second chulya, meaning 3 windings, just of techelet. You leave another little space and another chulya, 3 windings of just techelet, until you come to the final one. Then you do 2 of the blue and 1 additional of the white. So he wants it that you start with the white and you end with the white, and you're always doing 3 windings together according to the Rambam. Okay, and then in between a space, and I imagine it doesn't say it clearly, but I assume it's like we do it, that the space would then be filled with a knot, which is what we have, a double knot. And then he says, so the first one would be a white, then 2 blue, and then 3, 3, 3, and then 2 and 1. So you start with white, end with white. And he says the reason why we start with white is that the color should match the edge of the garment, and you end with white because he says that we don't decrease in holiness, we always add in holiness. And I guess if I'm understanding this correctly, the Rambam is kind of suggesting that the white is symbolic of rising rather than coming down in holiness, and that's why we conclude with this. Okay, and then basically you should do the same thing on each of the four corners of the garment. So you've got your 4 strings through in half, 8, wrap with 1 white, 2 blue, and then so on, end with the white. And so you've got these windings in groups of 3 with spaces or knots in between, and you do it on each corner. Now he says, at the Rambam here, you'll see the Rambam doesn't specify. He says, how many segments should you do on each corner? He says no less than 7, but not more than 13. So okay. He says that's the ideal way to do it. He says, but if you did only 1 winding, meaning 3 twists around, that would be fine. It would still be kosher. And if you wound just the blue around most of the tzitzit, that would also be kosher. But he says the nicest way, the most aesthetically beautiful way, is that you should have only windings of blue up to 1/3 of the string. And you'll see most tzitzit are made like that. So you see the full length of my string over here. You've got, this is the part where you've got the windings, and then you've got, this is the longer length of the string. So you've got at least, if you bend that over once and then again twice, I don't know how clear it's coming through there, you'll see that it's pretty much 1/3 of the length, which is basically what he says is ideal. 2/3 should be tassels hanging, 1/3 should be the part where you've got the windings around it. And he says, the tassels, you should make sure that they can hang separate. They shouldn't become caught up like, I guess, like dreadlocks, you know. In fact, every time you put on the tzitzit, you should make sure to just separate the strings, make sure they're all there, and make sure that they're actually hanging separately. Now, halacha 9, so he says, what happens if you made the tzitzit only with white strings? You didn't have the tchelet. And many of you will know, I mean, I'm showing you my talit over here. I don't have blue strings. Most of us don't have blue strings. It's becoming a little bit more common nowadays. Basically, for many, many centuries, the particular sea creature from which the tchelet, which is called the chilazon, was drawn, that particular blue dye was drawn, was unknown. In the last, I think, about 150 years or so, there was one of the Hasidic rabbis who found a particular creature. He made it his last kind of ambition that he believes is the chilazon and the tchelet, and therefore there was a small segment of people started to use the blue dye. Subsequently, I believe there's a second opinion what it might be, and it's becoming more popular. Obviously, production methods are a little bit easier nowadays, and so on. So it is becoming more popular, but I would still say most people consider it an unknown what the correct tchelet is. And because, as we've seen from the Rambam, and this is codified later, one fulfills the mitzvah even without it, most people don't have the tchelet. Okay, but he's saying, so if you don't have tchelet, what you do is you do the bindings or the windings with the white, and that's fine. And again, try to do it 1/3 of the length, so the 2/3 are hanging out. The kricha zoi, if you're following along, sorry, because I've been jumping Hebrew and English, you're following along, we're about here in the middle of the ninth halacha. He says, and he says that if you want to do these windings in the same way that you do it with the chelet, meaning in segments of 3 twists, that's great. And he says, indeed, that was the common practice in his time. And if you want to just wind it without making individual sections, that's also fine. He says the main thing is that he says the main thing is to try and fashion it that 1/3 is windings or bindings and the other 2/3 are the hanging strings. He says there are those who are not so particular if you only have white, in other words, to have the windings. And if you wound it around most of it, or even if you only did one little thing, that would also be okay. So I see that the sun seems to be, I hope that's a bit better. Well, as long as you can see the, oh, I see. Let me see if I can get something on top of the camera.
Perfect.
It's fine. Okay, you guys, as long as you can see the screen, that's more important. I'm only a small picture anyway. Okay, so I'll do that. The 10th halacha. Now he says something interesting, which is something that we're particular about. He says, whether you're talking about the white strand or the white strand or the blue strand, he says, if you want to make each strand an entwined strand, that means it's not just one piece of thread. but it's one strand made up of numerous threads, then he says it's great, you should do that. In fact, most tzitzit strings today, if not all, are made up of what we call 8 strands. In other words, within the one tzitzit string, it's made up of 8 threads that are wound together. And he says, he says, even if it's entwined from 8 threads, that's perfectly fine. As long as it's made into one strand, it's considered one strand. And like I said, that's ideal. That's what we try to do, that we have an 8-strand thread. Yud Aleph. Now, this is the important part of the mitzvah. He says, these strands, the white strand, or the one that is dyed, must be spun for the sake of doing the mitzvah of tzitzit. And in fact, every step of the process must be made with the intention of making it for tzitzit. So even as you're winding it, the minhag is that, as I showed you, we have knots. We've got 5 knots. So as you make the knot, you actually, as you're doing it, you say, L'shem mitzvah tzitzit. I'm doing this with the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit. And then each time you make a knot, you reiterate that, because every step in the process must be done with the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah. And like we see over here, even the production of the thread must be made with the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit. So, in other words, if it has to be made with intention, then one may not make it from wool which becomes attached to thorns. In other words, if the sheep was grazing and it gets pulled off, or from hairs that were just pulled off an animal, not from leftover strands that were left on the weaver's woof, right? Because these are, it needs to be something that's chashuv, something that's respectable, something that's important, something that was produced with intention. So you want to take wool that was shorn from the sheep and then produced specifically, or if we're talking about linen, if we take some of the flax that is going to be produced into the linen, it must be with intention. Furthermore, okay, you cannot make tzitzis from wool that was stolen. You cannot take tzitzis from what we call an irani dachat. You remember the laws of an idolatrous city that was needed to be destroyed. So if a sheep or wool came out of the city, you're not allowed to use that wool. Also, you're not allowed to use wool from animals that were set aside for sacrificial purpose. And if you did make tzitzis from any of these, it's invalid. The tzitzis are not kosher. He says if an animal was used in idolatrous practice, people bow down to this animal. You're not allowed to use its wool. He says, but if somebody bowed down to flax while it was attached to the ground, planted, but then it was detached in order to be made into linen, that's okay, because once it's detached, it's a completely new kind of reality and new identity. This would make sense. He says, therefore, a Gentile who makes tzitzis, that's not acceptable, right? It must be made with intention, therefore it must be made by a Jew. And he learns this from the emphasis in the verse. It says, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, speak to the children of Israel, v'asulam tzitzis, and they shall make for themselves tzitzis. The emphasis, v'asulam tzitzis, that they should make for themselves tzitzis, is that this is a process that must be done by the Jew himself. But if a Jew made it, even if he didn't have his intention, as we said in the previous halacha, you must have intention. But if you didn't have intention, it's still kosher. Now he says an interesting law. He says that tzitzis that are made from something that already exists is also unacceptable. And it goes back to this verse that you have to make tzitzis. What do you mean tzitzis that are already made? So he's going to give a few examples. He says, for example, Hevi kanaf sheyesh ba tzitzis utfara ala beged afilu yesh ba isa kanaf amal amal pasol. He says like this. So imagine I had a little piece of material that was just the size of this corner, okay, detached, and it had tassels already attached to it. Now I take this corner and I sew it onto a garment that's missing a corner. So what happens? The moment that this garment that I'm sewing it onto gets its corner, it also has tzitzis automatically there. That's not kosher, because it's what he calls ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. The mitzvah is to make the tzitzis, but not to have it made, have it be there. Okay, so that would not be okay. Okay, because it says if the mitzvah came on its own accord. Now he says it is permissible to remove strands of tzitzis where the water is from one garment and tie them into another. That's not a problem. But you can't have a ready-made tassel that was attached to a small piece of garment, even if it's the size of a garment that requires tzitzit, right? But you attach it to another garment, to its corner, that's not kosher tzitzit. We'll see one or two more examples in a moment. He says, what's the other example? So imagine you took this, let's say the four long strings, right? And now you've got a four-cornered garment with a hole on each corner. So let's say you thread this through the one hole, and you thread this one through the other hole, and then you fold them over like this, and you tie the tzitzis on this side, and you tie the tzitzis on this side, but basically they're attached as they go through the two edges of the garment. I don't know, I hope I'm explaining it clearly. So you've got four threads going all the way through. In other words, you didn't just fold it over onto one corner. You folded it through from this corner all the way to the next corner. And then you tied it into tzitzis, okay? And then what you do is once it's tied, the side that is connected, you cut. So now you have 8 hanging tassels on each side. Up until this point, you had 4 long strings connected and 4 hanging with the windings. And now you cut it so that there's 8 hanging tassels, and they're now separated onto each corner. He says that's unacceptable. That's the same idea, because when you're tying it, you're not tying it as a correct tassel, and when you cut it, it's just there on the garment. That's no good. As he says, right, the rationale is like this. At the time they were tied, they were unacceptable since the two corners were connected with each other by way of the strands. So when they are cut, and now you have 2 separate tzitzis, that's considered min ha'asui. Excuse me, this expression that he says, it says if it's already existed. And it's not ta'aseh, it's not making tzitzis. That's the problem. Halacha 15, hitul tzitzis ala tzitzis. What happens if I have tzitzis in the garment, and now I thread another 4 strings through the same corner, and I make them into tzitzis? So he says, if while I'm tying it, my intention is that I'm taking off the first one. Maybe it was a little bit frayed, and or they were a little bit dirty. I wanted new strings on. So I thread through another set of strings, and my intention is that I'm going to cut off the first set. He says, then it's fine. Okay, you can untie, or you can cut off the first set, and the one that you made is considered fine, because when you were making it, your intention was that you were getting rid of the other one, and it's fine. But if he said, should I ever, he says, but if his intention was that he's adding another thing, he wasn't intending to replace, he was intending to add, now he can no longer, in retrospect, say, oh, I'll cut off the other one. Because obviously what he then has is 4 corners and 8 tassels of 8 hangings, right? And he says, oh, that's too much, I want to cut it off. No, if your intention when you were putting it on was that you were replacing, and you only managed to cut or untie the existing one afterwards, fine. But if your intention was that you're adding it on because you think you're adding to the mitzvah, you can't now cut it off and try to make it right. So, because again, and he explains the rationale, because when you put the second one on, you're putting it on in an invalid way. And when you cut the first one off now, what you're doing is ta'aseh min ha'asui. It's not ta'aseh, it's min ha'asui. It's already there. And that's the problem. Again, by the way, it's an interesting law, this construct in halakha, ta'aseh, wherever the Torah tells us that you shall make it, and it should not be min ha'asui, it should not just be from something that was ready made, applies to the sukkah as well. So for example, theoretically, if the most important part of the sukkah is the schach, right? The branches, the leaves on the top. So theoretically, if I had schach on top of, like, let's say a pergola or something, and then I added the walls, that's not a kosher sukkah. It's min ha'asui. So I have to add the schach onto the structure. And there's other examples when it comes to sukkah, but it's this idea that it's got to be ta'aseh. You've got to make the sukkah with the intention, and you've got to make it. It's got to be an act of making, not that it just comes to be by taking something away or adding something that was non-essential. Halacha 16. He gives another example. He says, if you had a garment that had 3 corners, and then you made tzitzis on the 3 corners, and you added a 4th corner, you sewed it on, that's also not considered tzitzit, because when it was only 3 corners that did not require tzitzis, and now you're completing it, and the tzitzis just happen to be there. That's mina asui and no good. Halacha 17. Ein koitin esatalis l'shnayim matilin tzitzis al arba knofer she kfula and im kein tavakula afilim meruach achas. He says, don't fold over a garment, right? Imagine I've got a 4-cornered garment. So here's one corner, here's another corner, and then I've folded over. So now I've got, the fold is now a corner, right? Don't put tzitzis in this corner, because what's going to happen, let's say this is the corner, and I'm going to put tzitzis here, I'm going to open it up, then where am I going to have tassels? I'm going to have tassels on the edge, and I'm going to have tassels in the middle, and not on the other edge. So he says you can't do that, unless you actually sew it down, so that you know that the folded part is going to remain a corner. Okay, that's halacha 17. And the final halacha of the first chapter, I think it's the final halacha, yes. What happens, nifsafa, this is interesting because this seems to it'd be a little bit at odds with what we said, I think it was halacha 13. We said in halacha 13 that if you had a 3-cornered garment, or it was not 13, we had a 3-cornered garment, and then you had a piece of garment with a corner on it that has tzitzis, and you attach it to the garment, that's not kosher for tzitzis, right? But he says, what happens if I had a kosher tzitzis? And nifsach haknas, the corner now got ripped off, and it has its tassel still on it, right? So this corner here got severed from the garment. Okay, so he says if it was an amount of the garment larger than 3 fingers, right, and it completely ripped off, I can sew it back on, and it's kosher. So it's interesting because it was originally part of this garment, even though it's now come off, and so long as it was off the 3-cornered garment, didn't need tzitzit, and I'm putting it back on, it's now remade into a 4-cornered garment. If the portion that came off is considered big enough to be counted as a garment, and I put it back on, we imagine it as it was previously, and it's kosher. If it was smaller than the garment, he says that wouldn't work. If it was, in other words, if it was within 3, so let's say this is 1. Remember, because the minimum that it can be from the edge is 1 finger's breadth. So let's say it got cut 2 fingers breadth over the corner. He says that small piece that was ripped off, you can't put back on. Okay. Now what happens? Now he says, what happens if you nisma'ata zavit shalbeged? What happens if the hole became smaller? What it really means is that the hole got larger and came closer to the edge. Right. So let's say this hole started to rip. So now the string is hanging close to the edge of the garment. Initially, this hole must be made, as we said, 1 finger breadth or up to 3 finger breadths away from the corner. He says it doesn't matter. As long as a little bit still hanging there, it remains kosher, because initially it was placed kosher. Fine? Now, what happens if the tassels themselves start to fray? So according to the Rambam at least, even if they fray all the way down to the bottom, so there's only a little bit left. How much, he says, what length? As long as there's enough length that they can tie around each other, you can make a little knot with it. Right? In this knot, even if it's just enough to make a knot, so it's just a tiny bit of the tassel that remains, according to the Rambam, this would still be kosher. He says that's so long as the fraying or the tearing happens from the end, from anywhere up to here. He says, however, if it rips over here at the beginning of the strand, or at least it would be the middle of the strand, in this meikore, if the strand breaks at its root, kind of, then even if it's only one of these that gets ripped, it's no longer kosher. That would be considered pasul. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. Stop that share. I can pause that. And okay, well, I didn't take